Thank you for watching African Elements. In this video, we're going to look at African culture. Where does it come from and why is it important? Why does culture vary so much from setting to setting? Also, why is it important to understand African culture? We'll explore all that and more right now. Welcome back to African Elements. If you're new to this channel, we take curriculum that's geared towards students in higher education and we give it back to the people. We strongly believe this content should be freely available, but if you can and want to support this work, head over to our Patreon page at the link in the description. Otherwise, a like and subscribe would also go a long way towards supporting this work. Now, let's talk culture. I'll start with the basics. What is culture? This is a critically important term that's often used but rarely defined. For the purpose of this program, I'm going to define culture as beliefs, practices, and modes of being of particular people in a particular setting, adopted as a means of survival. Seems basic, but very important. Why do people do the things they do? Why do they structure their societies in any particular way? Why do they worship the way they worship? For the most part, that's going to boil down to a very simple and pragmatic reason: to survive. Understanding culture in this way makes it easier to understand, for example, why the continent of Africa itself is so diverse. In an upcoming video, we'll see how those elements of survival in West Africa, once they were brought to the Western Hemisphere, helped the people survive in the Caribbean, Brazil, and what later became the United States. Finally, the way I'm defining culture as a means of survival in a particular setting makes it easy to understand why, for example, to this day, black folks in Georgia are very culturally different from black folks in, say, Louisiana. We've got two different cultural settings and two different modes of survival that people have adopted, as we'll see. So let's look at the settings. The continent of Africa is an enormous landmass, taking up about a fifth of the Earth's surface land. It's approximately 5,000 miles from Tunisia to South Africa, north to south, and about 4,600 miles from east to west at its widest point. As you can see on the map, Africa can be divided into 4 regional climatic settings. Those settings are going to be the driving force that determines what type of society emerges. Is it going to be a city-dwelling urban society, or a semi-nomadic society that's going to embark on yearly cyclical migrations? Take, for example, the Saharan zone. The Sahara Desert is the largest desert on Earth. For many of the societies that live in this setting, key water resources are going to be an important factor around which cities and transportation are going to be built. The best known of those civilizations is Egypt. Egypt is a fairly typical river civilization, and it's heavily dependent on the annual flooding of the Nile River, which brings in nutrients into the Nile Valley that are essential to survival and makes it possible to harvest crops from year to year. Given that their lifeblood was the Nile River, and the key building blocks for society are literally flowing from that source, it makes sense that the Nile River is an ideal feature around which to build cities and urban structures. Interestingly though, those structures themselves tell you a lot about the culture and the setting that they're forged from. There's a very good reason, for example, why for the most part when people think of Egyptian culture, the pyramids are the first thing that comes to mind. It turns out that in a culture that's heavily dependent on knowing when these annual floods are coming, pyramids are very handy structures. They were very carefully constructed, oriented north, south, east, and west. 4-sided structures that are oriented in a very specific way. That's important because if your survival depends on knowing when these annual floods are coming, the pyramids will literally tell you that. Earlier civilizations had used mountains to determine the time of year by noting the sun's position each day using a notched measuring stick. In addition to being gigantic sundials, and with their very deliberate and precise orientation, the pyramids were a more enhanced and sophisticated method for determining the time remaining before the Nile began to overflow. Armed with this knowledge, they could prepare by moving silt from irrigation ditches that led to more distant plots used to extend the amount of arable land. Other aspects of Egyptian society also make perfect sense when you consider the setting. Patrilineal, patriarchal, male-dominated, hierarchical, and polytheistic, multiple gods. Some of the more prominent gods in the Egyptian pantheon consist of Ra, the sun god, whose essential role is to tell you when the floodwaters are coming. And of course, your lifeblood, the Nile, represented by Osiris. Also, if you're in a setting that relies on your sun god, Ra, or Osiris, god of the Nile, it would make sense that you would want your ruler to have a good relationship with the gods. As we can see, the ruler, or pharaoh, was endowed with godlike status. Again, the religion and culture that comes out of this setting is directly linked to how people survive in that setting. Moving on to another climatic zone, just below the Sahara, this green belt here is the Savanna grassland. The people of the Savanna grassland are much like the people of the grasslands in the plains region of the United States. The Lakota, the Arapaho, and the Cheyenne share similar cultural characteristics because they have similar settings. On the grassland, with its large game, which are constantly on the move, many are going to adopt a migratory or semi-migratory lifestyle, just like the people indigenous to the plains region of the United States. In terms of survival, cities don't make a whole lot of sense in this setting. People tend to have few possessions and travel light in order to keep up with their food source, which is the large game that is following these migratory patterns. So we can see here a very different set of strategies and a culture that's rooted in a specific setting. Much further to the south, we have another climatic zone, the Kalahari Desert region in southern Africa. Here you find the indigenous Khoisan, who are chronicled brilliantly in Noel Mostert's book, Frontiers, the epic of South Africa's creation and the tragedy of the Xhosa people. In it, Mostert describes two linguistically related people, the San and the Kwakwa, both part of the Khoisan linguistic family. One of the hallmarks of the Khoisan-speaking ethno-linguistic groups is the click consonants prevalent in the language, a language that will allow the speaker to blend into the background noise of rustling leaves and grass without giving away your position to potential prey items. A brilliant cultural adaptation embedded in a mode of speaking that serves as a very survival strategy in this particular setting. Now let's talk a little bit about West Africa, and specifically the region in this equatorial rain belt. Most blacks in the United States with a history dating back to the period of slavery came from this setting, a great many of them from the area of present-day Nigeria. It's a region that's thickly forested, but it's not particularly well suited for growing the various grains and cereals that you find in the sub-Saharan grassland. There are plenty of huge trees in this thickly forested region, but because of the constant soil erosion that comes from about 6 months of annual rainy season, agriculture can only consist of plants with deep roots that are not going to get washed away when the rains come. Culturally, your diet and the structure of your society is going to pivot around growing those things like yams, watermelons, sweet potatoes, radishes, and things that have deep roots. That's the only thing that can be grown there that won't be washed away when the rains come and erode the soil. Have you ever wondered why so many Americans consider apple pie to be America's pie, but if you ask most black folks, they'll say sweet potato? The labor-intensive nature of growing food in this setting will also be the reason why many West African societies tend to be communalistic. Communalism dictates that society functions best when we recognize our interdependence on one another. It's a worldview that's common throughout the African diaspora, as persons of West African descent in particular have been dispersed throughout the world. We find large family units with well-defined divisions of labor in which various age sets define one's role in society, along with elaborate rituals to mark the passing of one age set to the next. Interestingly, in West Africa, we also tend to find societies that rely heavily on oral traditions to pass along information from one generation to the next. Now, why don't they do it through writing? Are West African societies not as advanced as European ones? Well, in the interest of reframing the discussion, I question why there is a tendency to consider literary cultures to be more advanced. Who's defining what it means to be advanced and what criteria are being used? In the West African cultural setting, the means of survival dictate that transmission of information from one generation to another is not going to look the same as it's going to look in Europe. In fact, before contact with China, which is where paper as we know it today originated, Europe borrowed heavily from Egyptian forms of writing, which was written mainly on papyrus. Those materials weren't present in West Africa, so survival dictated that information be transmitted through other means. The tendency to note the cultural difference and then frame those differences in terms of societal advancement is largely a Western European way of looking at the world, and it's the world that this program, African Elements, flatly rejects. Since this program seeks to frame things differently, suffice it to say that Europe transmitted information one way and West Africans transmitted it another way, and there's nothing inherently more or less advanced in either method. So we've seen how various cultures arise from specific settings that societies find themselves in. But why is that important? Is it significant for Black folks within the Americas to understand the cultures of pre-colonial Africans? What about people of non-African descent? Why should they be concerned with African cultures? I'd be interested in seeing some respectful dialogue in the comments below. I'm Darius Spearman. If you found this video interesting, be sure to drop a like and consider subscribing. Also, hit that bell notification so that you'll be notified the next time a video drops. Until then, I'll see you in the comments.